Okay, hi, welcome. Welcome to Solidarity Speaks. I'm Vikki Reynolds, and I'm coming to you from Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh territories. I'm a white settler. My people are from Newfoundland, Ireland, and England. I'm cisgendered straight person, and I have a PhD, way too much school. I work mostly as a clinical supervisor, and I kind of identify most of the work that I try to do is bridging social justice activism into the stuff that gets understood as community work. And I'm so thrilled to be here with Kim Haxton today. We're going to talk about Kim's ideas and practices of lateral liberation. So maybe just let us know who you are.
Thank you, Vikki. So my name is Kim Haxton. I'm part of the 60s Scoop, and my family name is King. I am Potowatomi from a place called Wasauksing, and I belong to the Martin clan. And I also live out here on unceded and attested Coast Salish territories. It's funny. Somebody the other day asked me, and you forgive me, I'm going to swear, just so you know. They said, how is it that you do what's your qualifications? I think I've been asked that a lot of times, and at the one instance, I just said, it's 10,000 years of ancestral lineage. That's my qualification. Why does it have to be anything else, And the other day, this woman, we were talking about doing some mediation and conflict
Mm.
with some people, and she's like, what are the letters behind your name on that? I'm like, I grew up with some assholes in my family. Is That's my qualification, is being in lived experience. And she laughed and she's like, that's the best experience, and having to learn it in that way. I mean, yes, I do have some academia behind me, but my real sort of learned lived experience has been within Indigenous communities all over the world.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Lovely. Yeah, maybe say something about that. I always think, like, I always name that I have a PhD more as an accountability practice.
I think that's good.
Like, it's not the thing that qualifies me. One of the things I'm really out about is, I left being the addiction supervisor in the downtown east side of Vancouver at the busiest health clinic in Canada to go do my PhD. And one of the things I think about in terms of collective accountability is that wasn't just to promote me as an individual. That there had to be a political, like a usefulness to that. But I don't think there's many people walking around the downtown east side saying, thank God Reynolds got that PhD. I feel so much better about my homelessness now that she can wax eloquent about Foucault and Lacan and all that crap, right? So it's a piece of it, but
It's a piece of it. And I think there's an important piece that
mhm.
I can bring in. I come from a culture where we have a philosophy, and it's called two-eyed seeing. And I think Dr. Robin Kimmerer Wall speaks. She's a woman, a Potawatomi woman as well. Ethnobotanist talks about, her role, and it fits here in regards to being able to be in the academic world, but also to be in another world. So you're always holding that lens going back and forth. For me personally, when I think about two-eyed seeing, I think about, the wisdom of ancestors. And I also think about, into the future, what is our responsibility and accountability going all the way around for that. The future really depends on the literacy of the past. And I don't mean a colonial past. I just want to frame that up as I speak through an Indigenous lens. Looking these are my looking glasses into the colonial powers that be. You know,
Yeah.
and really kind of understanding or undoing sort of the places in which those colonial ideologies have become lodged in all of our bodies and our mindsets. And we look at the systems and the structures, but if we're going to be leading with wisdom, because we obviously don't lead with wisdom in the institutions. And I mean, I think people understand that. We can talk about that a little bit, I think. But I think there's a really important piece of what does that mean to live by guided by wisdom. We're taught how to be in these craniums, and it's great. However, when we look at all of the dismal sort of things that we've gotten ourselves into as a society, this here logical patriarchal capitalist brain, you know enculturated brain set has really created all of these things. And when we actually really think about, what does that mean? And when I say that, I often refer to the land. And I think that's the platform in which everything uh, goes from. It's funny, you'll hear me talk a lot about, well, science said, and then I always laugh because we know that all the old cultures inherently knew this because they weren't separated from nature. There was this, uh, I saw a talk, and I can't think of his name right now, but it was the best line. And I was in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and I was pulled in by the head of the Catholic Church in South Kivu, and they said, what are you doing here? And I'm like, I'm teaching decolonial trauma, through an Indigenous lens. And they're like, what are you talking about? And I'm like, well, uh, Thompson Highway, the playwright. Uh, he said this. He goes, well, in one world view, there's a story about a man and a woman named Adam and Eve, and they got kicked out of the Garden of Eden. And the priests were like, yes, true story. And I'm like, well, in another worldview, we never got kicked out of the Garden of Eden, And I think it's been interrupted
Mhm.
through colonialism, but we've never been kicked out of that. And so that's a different mindset and framework. And I want to sort of give a story around that first before we
Okay.
actually get into this. I think it's really important. So when I was Vikki and I both did the same undergraduate degree, which we were like, what? I'm like, nobody did that one. Yeah, we both went. I went to school for because there was canoeing, right? I'm like, that's what I need to go for, but yet, interestingly enough, that's been the formation of all of my work.
Yeah,
You know,
Kim and I went to Lakehead University and studied outdoor recreation. Like I seriously have a degree pretty much in canoe tripping. And we didn't know each other there and stuff like that. But I would also say, that job is the one that got me working with hoods in the woods, kids from jails on canoe trips, where I got more involved with the hoods than the woods, where I started to take apart these ideas of quote trauma and psychology and violent young men and started to work for liberation as an activist. And it's the stuff that led me to group homes and working with youth and all my work. So it's interesting, kind of life is a canoe trip at times, right? But
life is a canoe trip. You got to slow down when you hit the white water, otherwise you're going to tip upside down.
and I think about portages, right? This
Yeah.
isn't the stuff that's fun and everybody's got to get through and we go through once together, that
Yeah.
collaborative stuff. And I just think, yeah, I just think it's interesting that you and I met decades later and found this point of connection that actually explains a lot.
It explains so much, right?
Yeah. Kind of
And
about land-based ideas. Like I didn't come to therapy through therapy. I came to it through water,
yeah,
through lakes, through canoeing.
through land, right? It's foundational in who I am,
Yeah.
on so many different levels, like growing up on the land, the family I was adopted into uh, bought land, and I grew up on the land, in my summers of playing in creeks and taking care of animals, stewarding animals
Mm,
and growing vegetables and
yeah.
all those sort of things that I'm just so grateful for. And having that connection has been weaved through all of my life. And even it's funny, just recently, I just realized in this time of the pandemic that I can't do my work unless I have my hands in the earth, you
Yeah.
know? And it's changed now the nature of my work, um, uh, to where I'm working with organizations, and it's all on here on Zoom. But there's a place in which none of the work means anything unless I have that relationship for myself with the land.
Mhm.
I can't walk my talk or talk the walk or whatever the word is, right? If I'm not doing that, and it's essential to uh, I think life on earth, literally,
Yeah.
go figure that one. But even within an urban context, I think there's a place of displacement. But I want to share this story
Yeah.
because I think this is really important. I'm going to weave. I go all over, so you'll have to like bring me back in. Um, it was, I don't know, a long time ago, like 26 years ago, I think. Um, uh, I was in Southeast Asia and visiting a friend of mine, and he introduced me to a man named Mutang, who is from Borneo and is uh, really incredible human being. And he's Panan. And his father, the scientist and ethnobotanist and anthropologist, went to his father and said, how do you know which plants go together? And his dad said, because if the plants harmonize, you're going to make a medicine. If they don't harmonize, you're going to make a poison. And I remember at that time period, I really didn't, that it sounded cool, but I really didn't have any comprehension of that it was actually a real thing.
Mm.
Fast forward to, uh, I guess maybe 10 years ago, 11 years ago now, I was spending time in Latin America, and I was studying with different indigenous cultures who haven't lost their pre-Columbian spiritual teachings. I was working with a man named Jose Luis, an elder, a medicine person, and he was showing me how to make medicines. We were working over a open fire, and he was showing me this recipe, and I looked at him and I said, Jose Luis, like how do you know these plants go together? You like, like here I am, we're watching this, and he laughed and he said, because of the music that they make. And it was kind of a moment through time, out of time, really, connect me to that time that many years ago where I was just like, what? Right? Like, what? One of those holy shift moments that I was just like, I've had a few of them to sort of crack me open to sort of do that. But it's always been in context to, interestingly enough, plants, land, and indigenous cultures have been the biggest, connections pieces for me. And and I remember thinking, oh my God, like I still can't hear the plants sing. I mean, I see my plants in my house that they maybe they look like they're thirsty. I'm like, oh shoot, sorry, buddy. And I'm able to give them water. But I realized I, that as human beings collectively, we can't even hear ourselves think,
Mm.
let alone each other, let alone how are we going to save the birds and the bees and the bunnies if we can't even do that?
Mhm.
And I started seeing that in reflected in leadership, like a political
Yeah.
big global level. I started seeing that in the way that we treat each other in cities. We have such a like huge people who are displaced from their lands,
Mhm.
and I really just started connecting on it. And I was like, I never wanted to be an activist. That wasn't my thing. But it was just like every time I went somewhere, the connections were made so real to me. There's a teaching within every single indigenous culture, and it describes, it's not just that we're all one,
Yeah.
but the translation is like the trees and the four-leggeds and the holy ones that slither on their bellies, the ones in the water, the air and the fire, all of it is alive and related,
Mhm.
you know? And it really struck me as we live in a capitalist consumer society where all of us are involved in this like global slavery place, which, breaks my heart. And I just, it's kind of overwhelming. And I just realized the interconnection of that teaching just goes beyond our villages,
Yeah.
you know? And goes beyond our households. And it really, this is the place where I started thinking about how uh, how can we be accountable? Because this is really the conversation about accountability that
Mhm.
I kind of want to focus on. But it kind of through my journeys ended up in this idea, thanks to Roop Sadhu, a wordsmith. He said, "What about lateral liberation? Because we know about lateral violence, we know about the violence that happens within ourselves. We know the violence that happens in our communities and a global level. Like it's such a real thing." And I'm like, lateral liberation, what is it we need to do to pull things apart? Like I said, being the literacy of the past, and it's not, I use that word just because it seemed like a fun word to use, but I'm talking about the wisdom,
Yeah.
you know, and forgive me as I'm jumping over now to Vancouver Island to Kwakiwak territory. And I was there, and this esteemed elder named Adam Dick came into the room. I hope it's okay that I used his name. Some people, because there's an interesting thing about some of the oral cultures. Vikki, that people don't actually like their name used because it is an oral culture and it's a sharing thing. So I hope it's okay, that I've mentioned his name, but he came in with all these elders, other elders, and they came in and I was like, oh, look, the elders are here. And they looked at me sharply and they're like, we're not the elder. And I was like, what? And then this really beautiful little old man came in on his walker and his eyes were like, when old people get like those blue translucent eyes.
Mhm.
And I was like, whoa, this dude is ancient. And he came in and he sat down and he shared his story. But the part of the story that I want to share that I think is important that weaves into this is that he said, uh, I've had the direct teachings and transmissions from my own culture. What you don't realize is that it exists in your cellular memory. And this was another moment of like, shifting my perspective to realize, we are so shut down.
Mm.
When you start looking at the brain science, because I'm like, how do I make this a real thing? I started learning about it, the brain and the oldest part of the brain, the amygdala. You could explain this way better than I can. The fight, flight, fear, freeze. That's a little spark plug. That's how I describe it to my friends. There's a little spark plug inside our brain. And it often carries out these places and when we're stressed or in trauma. So I
Mhm.
started looking at that as intergenerational trauma. But then I just realized right now, on a huge level, everybody is in a state of uncertainty and stress. We're looking at the polarization.
Yeah.
And this is the piece that I think is really important about is that we do this and the fight is like this and the fight doesn't stop and it's not working. It's important to say no in the face of injustice. That's true. But how do we do it in a way that it just doesn't end up doing this, right?
Mhm.
And it's a really big, I think it's a really big piece on so many different levels. So one, people have to heal. We right now I'm doing a lot of work around reconciliation, and it's like, okay, we have these systems and these structures that don't work. That's one part of reconciliation. Is like, how do we redo that?
Yeah.
Another one are for all the settler people is actually learning, the history and the cultures, the rich cultures that have been here before you came, and the land that you live on is from coast to coast to coast is 100% indigenous land.
Mhm.
People get upset about that. They're like, yeah, but, and I'm like, well, you know, uh, I don't want to totally get into that realm because I'm in that realm all day, but
Yeah.
because I want to talk about lateral liberation, but it's important to understand why the constructs that we're in actually aren't true. And when you actually start looking at the legalities, it's not true,
Yeah.
you know? And so for the indigenous folks, the Mi'kmaq, the Wet'suwet'en, the people in New Caledonia, you know, all these people saying no, no more, is really important, but how do we literally just lift each other up, you know and how do we do it in a way that that people can be self-reflective
Mhm.
and make space for each other voices, marginalized voices,
Mhm.
when we've all been indoctrinated into like a mainstream place. So I talk about lateral liberation
Yeah.
in the context of like uh you know uh how do we go beyond the ideas that we've all been into something else. One of my teachers talks about, because I was really worried about the forest fires, like it's so horrific to see it, like anywhere in the world it is horrific. It's not giving meaning to that, but he said, Kim, you have forgotten about the intelligence of the fire. People have lost that connection. People have lost the connection with so much. And again, it just, I held it and I was like, wow, it is a reflection of our uh, not considering, what's the disconsideration? Is that a word?
Sure.
You know what I'm saying, right?
Yeah. Disregarding.
Disregarding, thank you. Disregarding of that relationship,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
And we've gotten ourselves this far in. And it's kind of, when I look at the statistics of scientists and stuff like that, when I look at like the global picture, when I look at like climate change, it's pretty dismal. like when, if those numbers are right, when
Yeah.
I look at the social and political aspects, just within Canada alone of Indigenous people, I'm just going to throw out a couple numbers because I think
Yeah.
it's important. Is that with Indigenous peoples in Canada is 7 times higher suicide rate than anywhere in the world. You know, when I think of that, when I think of 50% of human trafficking in Canada is Indigenous people,
Mhm.
you know, and it really, when you start holding the
Yeah.
scope, the brevity of all of those things, you know, I'm always like, what, why? You know, like weren't we all taught to have good manners and treat each other well, you know? And I just realized we don't, you know, we don't on so many levels. So that's where the sort of concept um, was that idea. And then, I mean, it's not my idea because really it's about all of the teachers and elders from
Right.
different cultures around the world that I've sat with. You know, I worked with a woman named Grandmother Sarah Smith,
Mm.
who she has since crossed over. She's Mohawk. She's from Six Nations in Ontario. And she said this, and I remember at the time I was like, I don't know, but I really, it was like from a bunch of grandmothers, and they're like, we're going into a birthing time, Kim, where you know, these are the prophecies, and we know that in birth it's painful, it's uncertain, it's scary, but we're birthing something new. And it doesn't, and when I say that, I just,
Mm.
without getting into the right and the wrong, because this is the game, we get caught in the binary of right and wrong. And we know that there's all of this other area, right? I mean, there's a whole, uh, oh, who's that woman? Karen, I can't think of her name. She's a professor down in Santa Cruz, and she talks about um, what's in the middle of an atom.
Oh,
She talks about this, she's queering astrophysics basically, and
right.
she talks about this non-binary place, and I see this emergence right now
Right.
of all of these young beautiful, and I call them babies, and I mean, you know, anybody who's younger than us is a baby,
Mhm.
right? You know, we have to take care of each other. These people, these young people who are coming up, who are in this non-binary place, and I'm just like, thank you. You know, like I can feel it in my soul, and I'm like, okay, you know, Auntie has to make room for young people, and I'm looking at people in Canada, and it's not an age thing. I don't mean that.
Mhm.
Um, People who are so used to a certain narrative, you know, and not out of a blame or shame, Vicky, because it can easily be like, oh, well, you're dumb,
Yeah.
you know, because you don't know this. I don't mean you, but I mean,
Yeah.
you know, but I'm just like, wow, people just don't know, you know, and we can, it's not even in it. Like some people might say it's innocence, but I don't think so. It's not even ignorance. It's kind of a combination of all of those things, but it's like, come off it. It's time actually that it's time to not just rewrite the story, but to walk in a good way. One of the elders, a Choctaw elder I worked with for a long time, he always talked about walking in a good way.
Yeah.
He always said, Kim, quit being in judgment,
Mm.
right? And I'm just like, I am one judgmental person, right? Hmm.
I think as you're talking, I'm thinking about Jessica Yee, Aboriginal woman who's the person who's the executive director of the, I think, what in Ontario, the sexual health, Aboriginal sexual health, who talks about educational violence, right? Pedagogical violence, that I'm going to be 60 this year. And that when I went to school in Toronto and didn't even know whose Indigenous territories I was on, you know, I was taught this mythology of the disappearing savage, you know, that there were Indians here and they built wigwams and then they, you know, mysteriously disappeared. And then we had the battle of the plains of Abraham of the French versus the English, and the French still don't know that they lost, you know?
Right.
And thinking about that's one thing. And I think about that as a white settler. And when I talk to other settlers, whether they're white or other locations, that people have been lied to very systemically, structurally, and you're not responsible for being lied to. But once you know you're being lied to, I'm just thinking about that lateral liberation having room for me. If I'm going to enter that space, I
Hmm.
have to go learn the truth of where I'm standing, standing on ground saturated in the blood of genocide we haven't named, right? And how to, you know, the unsettling myself as a white settler, but like the path of that, the work of that as a life task, right? Before, maybe before I'm able maybe that's the first, I just don't know. But in terms of lateral liberation, I'm just thinking there's obviously multiple paths given people's different relationships to the land, right?
Yeah, and I think that's the accountability piece.
Mm,
I often talk to different groups about citizenship. Where's your citizenship?
mm,
You know, and people say Canadian or the motherland, wherever the motherland is, and I'm like, yeah, but you live here and your probably kids are going to be here. But so let's talk about neighborhoods,
mm,
because your citizenship, like, I live in East Van, right? I don't live
yeah,
in Pitts. I don't live at
yeah,
UBC or West Van.
yeah,
I live in
yeah.
East Van. There's something that we hold in that, and I often am like, well, what does that actually mean? And
Mm,
and I think the thing about the relationship, there's 5 selves that are universal for healing.
mm,
Okay. And this is like guaranteed everywhere, pretty much guaranteed everywhere in the world, I'd imagine. Anywhere that I've been, every culture has singing, every culture has dancing or movement, right? Every culture has storytelling. Everybody has sat around for, ever around the campfire and told stories. And we do that in, modern context through films and all of those things. Every single culture has some sort of form of prayer or meditation or ceremony, and that could be like, whether it's in a religion or whether it is being out on the land, it shows up in different ways. And every single culture has a place in which there's a connection to land, because we eat food. Some people are unconscious about what we eat, for sure, but there's still moments in which we do connect with nature, and everybody does in an instant. For example, the sound of a thunder clapping, boom,
yeah,
you know, the beautiful sunsets that we see here in the summertime that are just like glorious, that that there's millions of people in the greater Vancouver area who are all having a moment, all at the same time. And yet we are so disconnected from that it really it makes me think, Vikki, on a couple of different levels. It makes me think about how do we have that place in which we have connection.
mhm,
you know what do we have to do, right, to actually have connection? And because I even think of somebody like, I don't even want to bring his name into our chat room, but
yeah,
the guy south of the border right now, who
yeah,
is an obvious, classically narcissist and all those different things. Ultimately, every single human being wants to be seen, heard, and celebrated. Like,
yeah,
that's just the recipe.
mhm,
It's true. Some people receive it, some people don't receive it, and it shows as we get older on the way that we are able to be with each other. A lot of, I've seen in my time that people who don't necessarily have human social skills are really good with animals, are
mhm,
really good with the birds, are really good with it doesn't matter, and they have a place of that connection that I think is so imp- important, and I'm always interested in, like, how do we just reach in and just learn to be with each other? And part of it is listening, you
mm,
know, that's kind of one of the steps. Um, I want to talk about, when I say listening, when I told that story of the 2 elders who talk about listening to the plants,
yeah.
and,
Hearing them sing.
right, the
Yeah.
plants thing. And I'm just like, what it made me think about, Vikki, was like, um, is we don't, uh, when we're in conversation with other people, we're often already formulating a response.
Yeah.
We're not able to just sit and hold. I mean, as a therapist, that's your job, is to, you learn how to do that, right? Is to really
Mhm,
hold people's stories,
mhm,
and it's hard to, they don't teach us that, right? They think, like, when we think of law and practice, it's like in it to win it, the hyper capitalist model, my idea is the best idea, and I'm just like, whoa, whoa, whoa. And we see it in all of these, well, we see in it's a society that we have lived in. But what I started thinking about on that was like, after being able to spend time in different indigenous communities, um, I watched something and witnessed something like that I saw with Mutang's dad, and what I also saw with, um, Jose Luis, is a place of knowing. And some people might call it intuition.
Mm,
And but I don't think that's a big enough, broad enough word. Some people, and it's a way of knowing,
mm.
and I'm like, I'm not sure. I still don't have the proper word or description.
Yeah.
I just know that we synthesize information on so many different levels that aren't necessarily recognized by the industrial academic complex, capitalist patriarchal complex that we live in. For example, um, another one was Larry Muirlikov, who is an Aleut elder from up like Alaska area. And he talked about going seal hunting with his elders, and everybody sitting there drinking tea and chitty chatting. And moments before a seal pops its head through like 7 feet of ice or 10 feet of ice, everybody goes silent.
Mm,
And time again, boom, there's a seal. And he said, it's not possible, And I remember him saying that. And I remember just being like, whoa, like we've been out on the ice in the winter, and it's loud on top, but from underneath, no, and he asked them, how do you know? And that was a big, like, another moment for me where I was like, how do you know? Um, I want to share a story about kind of that. I'm a storyteller, obviously.
mm,
Uh, I come by it naturally, it's in my blood. But I've had the privilege of being able to go overseas, uh, and it's been nothing but uh, really cool experience for me, because I can blend in sort of in places, and people are like, oh, you're a big fat happy Thai person. I'm like, oh no, I'm not, and but people don't recognize, Indigenous Canadian. They're like, you can't be from Canada, you don't look Canadian. And I'm like,
yeah.
wait a second, all these things. But one of the places I ended up in was Haiti
Mm,
after the earthquake.
mm,
And one of my mentors, Dr. Beth Hedva, brought me down with her to, hold space literally. And of course, when I was down there, we were working in a university. That was great. But, I was like, what's the culture here? And sure enough, I got to meet a couple that are Vodun practitioners.
mhm,
It was like I walked in the room and they saw me and I saw them, and we were just like, hello.
mm,
And so I spent the next 4 years going back and forth and spending a lot of time with Michel and Roseline, their partners.
mhm,
And it was really incredible what I got to witness, and another Indigenous culture of plants and different modalities of healing and knowing.
mhm.
Um, I hadn't seen him in a year, and I think this is another moment where I'm just like, how does this really happen? I walked in, I hadn't seen him in, no, probably about 8 months was the last time I'd been there. And I went down again. And in that period of the time that I hadn't seen him, I'd been invited to go through Beth Hedva over to the Congo to do a leadership program, right?
Mhm.
And I was like, I don't want to go there. That place is scary. Like, I've heard bad things about that place, and as I was, holding that, and I walk into his house, I haven't seen him in 8 months, and he looks at me and he goes, oh, granddaughter, and he hugs me,
Mm,
and he said, the African spirits are going to take care of you. Don't worry. And I was like, okay, dokie. Where does that come from? Where does that knowledge come from? Again, my learnings and my teachings around lateral liberation. And so, in a nutshell, I think this is important of the concept of where it's all connected.
yeah.
The concept that we understand now that the mycelium under all the trees talk to each other, and there's this big, all these things happening all the time. And I needed something really concrete. So like, it's like, I
Mm,
talk to people about, if I put a radio here in the middle of the room, when we would turn it on to like CBC, we could all listen to CBC. If I were to move that radio out of this room, those radio waves are going through this room. True? And everyone's like, yeah, oh yeah, yeah.
mhm.
and I'm like, there is energy all the time of things that we're not even aware of around us. We get feelings like, ooh, that's creepy. We get feelings of places of like, uh, some of us are really good at listening to our intuition,
Mhm.
and we get all these different places in which, some of us become more listening to the voice, because some people hear voices, uh, or, and I always give examples to people, here's an example that everybody has had where you think of a friend that you haven't talked to in like forever. And then all of a sudden the phone rings and you're like, no way. That's, and it's actually not. It's just because we haven't been trained, right? We haven't been taught to use that place. And I think that's the key there, is that we don't have right relationships because we actually don't know how to listen and be in that place with each other or ourselves. And especially with the mantle, because everything is on the mantle of the earth,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
And so it really is about this practice of like, what are you emanating and what are you holding? And because the things we hold, we don't need to hold,
Yeah.
right? We personalize things
Yeah.
but it's like, and then we become inept, right? It's like the triage of first aid where they're like, danger to yourself or to others, right? Those sort of things. But it's like, it is true. We become uh in in, in useless. I can't
Yeah.
think of the word.
Incapacitated or
Yes, thank you. That's the
yeah.
word. I'm gonna
Yeah.
give you 5 points for every word. Thanks. Right? That we don't even actually know how to
Yeah.
be. So that's really the foundation of different teachings that have come together to make me go, okay, so how do we actually understand our own responsibility? So in the whole idea for me around reconciliation, there's the structures and the systems. That's a big one, right?
Mhm.
There are the settlers
Mhm.
who, benefit off of living here.
Mhm.
And then there are also Indigenous peoples and our own work that we have to do, that I think is important, and it's got nothing to do, it's as we bring back our power, as the interruption becomes uninterrupted,
Mm.
as I'm seeing communities, uh, right now, the pandemic, one of the beautiful gifts that was given, there's so many different communities I see that are starting to garden,
Mm.
right? We're talking about sovereign nations. We're
Yeah.
talking about people being responsible for themselves, and it's the ripples are starting to happen, right? It's starting to happen, and we're seeing it from community to community. So it's like not just one place.
Yeah.
We're seeing it all over. We're seeing these power structures and people going, hang on a second. We're also seeing people, because the old adage I love, for anybody who's ever seen the film Shrek, that kids movie,
Mhm.
there's a part where the donkey's walking across and he's like, change is good, donkey. And I'm watching, we're witness people who's like, it's uncomfortable that I have to change my
Yeah.
positionality. But it's like, holy smokes, right? Like we're seeing it with the Mi'kmaq and what's happening to them and the people that are just, acting absolutely, from this righteous amygdala little brain part of themselves that, they need to be like fearful. And I don't know what the word would be, but there's like such a fear of not enough, of a hoarding culture,
Yeah.
you know,
Scarcity.
scarcity.
The
Yeah,
mythology of scarcity, right? Which is like the heart of capitalism. You've got to hoard. It's interesting, hey, you've got to hoard. If if homeless people have too much in their cart, we call them hoarders. But rich people who own houses they don't even visit, that's hoarding. You have to have more than your share of resources.
right. Yeah, it's like a thing, and that makes me think about a couple things on that, because this was another learning that I've had in regards to being able to be traveling
Hmm.
to places, and it was really about gifting and charity. You
Hmm.
know,
Hmm.
when I think of nature, my first reflection is a raspberry bush or a blackberry bush. They're kind of invasive, but whatever. Black currant, whatever you want, whatever kind of, and you walk along, and we've all done it here in Vancouver because there's like blackberries everywhere, raspberries that are like, and you're like, and it's such a beautiful gift to have, and we don't
Yeah.
even think about it as a gift,
Yeah.
and it is a gift. The raspberry doesn't care where it goes to, whether it's a little bird that's going to gobble it or it's a
Mhm.
two-legged.
Mhm.
It doesn't care. It just produces this beauty, you know. And then when I think of and I bring it to this, and I think there's a couple things. There's a fourth century Jewish scholar, and I think it's important because when I think of our society and the Judeo-Christian capitalist society that we live in, I don't know if you can match those, but it seems appropriate.
Mhm.
Um, and Maimonides, he talks about, I think, 7 or 8 levels of giving,
Mm.
of gifting. And, and the one is like the raspberry bush, where the giver gives without knowing where it's going, and the receiver receives without knowing where it's coming from. Beautiful. To the extreme of the giver gives belligerently and the receiver is like, oh, please, right? And when we look at the dynamics of our society, you
Mhm.
know, whether it's like funding models, whether it is our, I don't want to name any names, but our institutions that are like, you can have this much money for your program, especially for the nonprofit, right? Which is also a place of like, indoctrinated, like, oh, can we have some, and it creates this cycle of like have and have not at this end. When we look at our institutions, it also is on this end of the spectrum. But then when I started looking and going into other cultures, it's not like that.
Mm.
You're in the West Coast potlatch culture, your status is on how much you not give away, how much you take care of your community with food and all the appropriate things. You know, we know that when settlers first came to Canada, Indigenous women held the economic power.
Mm.
They knew where the families that needed to be fed. They knew what needed to be done in a good way. You're looking at a couple of cultures. Nepal, there's a group of people that have a really amazing sort of economic system. There's the Panan, I believe it's a Panan, who, if I bring in a gift of tobacco, every single person in the family gets, the baby and the grandma get the same amount of tobacco. Everybody gets equally gifted, and really, I mean, I do, I'm just like, but a baby doesn't need tobacco. And like, do you know what I mean? I get caught in all of these and I'm just like, holy, that's not the point, you know? And so when I think of, what is it, uh, when I think of that, I think about our bodies.
Mm.
This is the most important thing, Vikki, to me, is a teaching that I received one time in ceremony was that this breath, right? This breath is a prayer.
Mm.
And it relates into different cultures. The etymology of the word breath, when you look at it, actually translates as spirit.
Mm.
Right? And so the first relationship and everything in Indigenous cosmology is in relationship. Okay. And I think that's an important piece.
Mhm.
And the first thing that we have when we come out of our mama's belly, our first relationship is with the breath, not our mama's, it's the breath. Right.
Mm.
And I think there's a really important thing. And when you look at little babies and their bellies go, it's just amazing, right? And you're like, wow, look at their belly going out. That's a lot of work. But when most of us don't breathe, you know?
Yeah.
And I noticed that as I was telling this story, that I could feel all this energy in my body. And we're so in here that we forget about, that it is a intellectual, a physical, emotional, and a spiritual realm that we exist in, I love how the Maori people, and there's a few other cultures too, that talk about how this right now is not the real time that you and I are in.
Mm.
It's when we go to sleep is actually our dreaming space is actually the real time. Is actually when we do the work,
Mm.
you know? And I think about that, and it may seem, surface on some level, but when you actually start following in and paying attention,
Mhm.
where there's actually really amazing things that are revealed to us if we're open to it.
Yeah.
And I know some people don't dream, for various reasons,
Yeah.
but I'm really, we're missing out on our education on so many different levels, and so when I look at all the things going on around us, I'm like, well, no wonder we are.
Yeah.
We pathologize a lot of mental health stuff
Right.
when we know that in cultures, people had gifts. I mean, I had the gift
Yeah.
of spending time with one of the 13 Indigenous grandmothers, uh, Amadoka, who is a Nepali medicine person.
Hmm.
And for sure, she would have been diagnosed with mental health stuff here.
Yeah.
Because I would watch her go into ceremony and she'd be like, "Hi, Kim." And then I'd watch her switch. And it was like, I'm just like, kind of scary and amazing,
Yeah.
you know, brilliant. And it just really we don't have a place for that here.
Yeah.
I mean, we know what that place is and where it ends up, you know?
Hmm.
And that's sort of like, and it's not just that, it's like the environment, and there's all the people, that we don't take care of. There are, we're looking at mass migrations of people because the equatorial zones are becoming unlivable, uninhabitable for food and water, and we're looking at all these things, and it's like, and then we have all these like kind of like, I'm going to say jackasses,
Hmm.
kind of clowns in, the last of the patriarchy who are like, rah, rah. And, the other day, Vikki, I was laughing because I just out loud where, I don't know, a picture came up on my screen and it was a bunch of old white men, politicians. And I just looked at it and it looked so silly to me. I just laughed. I'm like, what are they thinking? They're like all these old guys, like where's your sense of dignity? You're supposed to be an elder and not trying to yield power over,
Yeah.
especially the power that they have is not, a place of equitable. It's not a place from heart. It's a place of this, it is a mental health problem,
Hmm.
you know, and power is a corrupt thing, right? It
Yeah.
can be.
I'm thinking as you're speaking, I'm thinking so many thoughts, Kim, as whenever we talk, like there's just so much going on. But I'm also thinking about Frantz Fanon, you know,
Yeah.
s- psychiatrist from Martinique, Black man, who died decades before I was born. And I'm going to be 60 this year. And he went to Algeria in
Yeah.
the war for independence in Algeria, where the French were doing widespread torture of Algerians. And in The Wretched of the Earth, which was published before I was born, he talked about the fact that psychology is used to is weaponized against colonized people to show it's a new instrument, of dehumanization, to
Mhm.
show how the colonized folks are actually mentally ill, when in fact we should be way more concerned about the lack of mental wellness of the colonizer.
Yeah.
And this was said before I was born. It's kind of the crux of all the work that I have done. And I've gone to school for 27 years and never heard him referenced in school. And of course, that's about the specificity of anti-Black racism, that certainly a Black psychiatrist is not going to get listened to. A direct action activist who's a revolutionary is not going to get listened to. But I'm just, as you're speaking about these ways, that, and Alan Wade and Nick Todd have written about psi-colonization, the
Mhm.
ways the instruments of colonization line up so well with the instruments of psychology,
Mm.
separating people, deciding what's normal will be what's normal. If you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs,
Yeah.
whoever's on the top, that's normal,
Yeah.
and every act of resistance is seen as more evidence that you're mentally unwell. An Indigenous person that, yeah, is, fighting back with everything that they've got is seen as belligerent, angry, violent, all kinds of things, right? These kind of,
Exactly, right?
yeah. And I'm just, as I'm listening to you thinking about this, I'm just thinking, I really loved what you said about right relations. That like the problem is that we're not in right relations on so many levels you've been talking about. And I'm wondering how that like connects to lateral liberation, those ideas of right relations. And I also know, as a white settler and you being an Indigenous person, you can't tell me everything. So I'm aware in this conversation of what is being said and what is not being said.
So I think, thank you, Vikki. I think there's a really profound piece on that one, and it just goes with a simple this is kind of it. There's a philosophy in a lot of Indigenous cultures of non-interference, and that's not the right word.
Mhm,
Where we let each other be,
mhm,
learning to be with ourselves, letting others be with themselves, letting go of the issues that bind us, right?
mhm.
Because we get caught in this push and pull place. And I think there's a key piece here. So in our communities, right, we often get, and I just want to, I just, before I say that, I just want to remind everybody that I'm speaking from an Indigenous perspective. And I want you, whoever you are, to watch yourself and your reactions. And often when I start groups, I say, okay, like when you go hunting, you're tracking an animal. I want you, everybody, to track themselves right now and your responses on how you feel when I say things, not just here, but I mean, I want you to follow your own
Mhm,
little wild self, right,
mhm,
so to speak. And so there's a piece which we are not held accountable or responsible for our beings. We can create tears in the fabric of the universe, and we can also repair. I think about how much, um, what's the word I'm looking for? Uh, how much creativity and beauty and music and all of the exquisite, the fall colors, like there's so much beauty around us, and yet we like to inhabit, because we're lazy, I think, this destructive pattern, whether it's to ourselves or to the world around us.
mhm,
We just, oh no, it's okay. It's okay. Well, this is what it is. I need a new cell phone. I need this. And we're just like, but, and it's like, no, it's not. Like, please stop shopping at that place called Whole Foods. Like, that's owned by that guy, Jeff Bezos. He doesn't need any more money.
mhm.
Like we are operating out of the right, not in right relationship. Could you just say what you just said? Because I kind of went off there, but
Oh, I was just thinking about, I was thinking so much of everything that you've said, and I was thinking about, I liked your language about right
oh,
relationships, and that one of
yeah,
the barriers to us having lateral liberation is that we're not in right
yeah,
relationships.
yeah, yeah. I often yell at people, stay in your lane, because we have people that, we talk about cultural appropriation,
Mhm.
and we're always doing these things. We're taking only the little bits that we want because it works for us,
Yeah.
all this entitled place instead of like the discipline of what it actually means. And so I think about this, and I think about, concentric circles,
Hmm.
and I think of each person in the center of it, you, and all the things. If you think about the things that each of us are burdened with,
Yeah.
depression, anxiety, um, whatever the discomfort is, addictions, what doesn't matter what it is, righteousness. That's a really good one that we get caught in, right?
Yeah.
This is the right way, or we get caught in, like our projecting stuff and just like all of these things that we do, or we feel lesser than, doesn't matter what it is, all the things that throw us off balance. Um, uh, and then our community and our friends and our families, where some of those behaviors are learned. Maybe you're lucky because you grew up with families who gave you lots of love, or maybe like most people you didn't, and so you got the school of hard knocks. um, you can't change history, but you can change the way in which how you walk, and those beautiful, and I say beautiful, I mean, and those lessons that give us the wisdom, right? Wisdom doesn't come from inaction, and wisdom comes from like
Mhm.
generally a lot of different things. You don't just earn wisdom, right? You just don't get wisdom given to you, right? And not everybody has wisdom, um, and when I think of all the things that we, the provincial or national or global things happening, it's all of these things that are around us and pulling us out. And no wonder we're affected. We're seeing the slaughter of Black people every day when we turn on our, any social media in the United States. We're, what's happening here in Canada with Indigenous people, and it's just like, it is overwhelming. Go back to the
Yeah.
itty committee, our brain, and we get into places of denial so that we can just function, right, in an abused relationship.
Mhm.
We can be, put our heads like, it's not happening, don't talk to me. Or we can be like, I'm going to save the world. And then we like burn out because, you know, that's also a reactionary place, right?
Mhm.
Out of balance. And, you know, or we get into the fight, 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 but then it's like it eats you, consumes you, holding that energy, right? I think about these things. Or we just run away and be like, oh, I'm going to go up to Whistler, see you later. Nothing wrong with going to Whistler, anybody, but you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think about that. How can we be responsible to like just slowing it all down? Like we're in the white water, we're heading into the canyon. It's a little bit unknown.
Mhm.
You know, keep your paddle in the water. You know, back paddle, so you can read the channel. So you're not just going to go and like a maniac and hit a rock. That you can see where the channels move. And it's like there's that level that we don't do in a hyper capitalist society is to slow down.
Yeah.
I remember a long time ago, this old Rasta guy said, Kim, go slow, you know? And I remember um, this was in Belize, and there was like a gunfight,
Mm.
and everybody was running helter skelter. And I remember just slowing down, and I could hear the old man. I could see him and it
Mhm.
going, Kim, slow down. And I slowed down and put my back against the wall. I was like, what? Like, this isn't. And the guy with the gun ran past me and he looked at me and he nodded and he smiled. And I just was like, but it was a moment in time where I was like, he was right. Slow down. You know,
Yeah.
like it's easy to panic and run. But again, we get into these things where we panic, gotta get this done, gotta do this, gotta do this. And it's like, slow it down. You know, we get caught in righteousness,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Like, why is it that people, what stops change?
Mm.
You know, and I ask people that, and I don't mean the minute you're looking outside of yourself.
Yeah. Yeah.
uh-uh, it has to come from here,
Mm.
right? And so there's a guy, and Dene man named Dr. Michael Smith, who's a Chinese medical doctor, and he talks about undomesticating ourselves,
Mm.
you know. And when I think about that, you know, and I really, those words stuck with
Mhm.
me, and I'm just like, we are so caught up in, there's a whole sort of, and you could probably speak more to this than I can, but Victorianism,
Mhm.
and how some of the ideologies that came out of that time area we still hold as social customs of what's right now, you
Mhm.
know, here. One example that I can give of that, maybe it is even before Victorianism, but it's the whole concept of birthing. And we're seeing the change in that, you know, in the midwives. But when you look at the time period in Europe, and so this is where I say to people, stay in your own lane and do your own healing, right?
Yeah.
Because people don't even realize the levels of oppression in their locked into their bodies that they've brought with them. You know, they carry, because it's just so seems so far in the past, but like let go of this whole idea of time. And where they, when they killed off all of the witches and burned the witches, they actually burnt the midwives and the medicine women, and there was a lot of knowledge lost. So it became medicalized, and in the medical theaters, think of like Frankenstein, where there's that tablet and then all the people sitting up here. And the only thing they had for birthing, to teach birthing, were cadavers.
Mhm.
uh, and they had to put them on the, of course the legs would be like this, but they had to break their legs and put them in stirrups
Mm.
on the table, and this is how you birth babies, which actually became a medical practice right up until I think maybe 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah.
You know, when people are like, hang on a second, it's actually from cadavers, it's not a natural way that, you know, women want to dance and move and do a lot of things, right? And so when I think about some of those things, I mean, that's just a medical thing, but there's like other ways in
Yeah.
which we have our social customs, right? And I think about that, Vikki, and I'm just like, how is it that we like,
Yeah.
you know, get wild? And
Yeah.
I don't mean that in a way, but I mean, how do we get free?
How do we, yeah, undomesticating ourselves, right?
Right, you know?
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, I mean, I like having a roof over my head. I've lived a lot in the bush, most of my life actually,
Mhm.
in the bush, in a tent, and out of a backpack, and I've loved my time like that. But this is a different time now that I'm like, oh, this is what I actually need to do now. So,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. Thanks for that. Wow. This has been a really cool journey going on, just like following you through some of these understandings and stories. I want to thank you for like all the storytelling and just this idea about lateral liberation. What would it mean to be truly wild, to be free? What would that look like in terms of collective accountability? And then those ideas about yeah, right relations and what's, and that there's many paths for that, that people have a lot to unpack with that. I'm just wondering if there's anything else floating around in your head you kind of just want to lay out.
I just stick
Yeah.
my fingers into the socket of the universe and see what happens now. Um, I think, there's a place in which, like, how do we do, I ask people, so the other question that I ask people is like, eh, we all need to do this work together, you know? And it's so easy to other
Yeah.
people, you know? Um, and and I'm like, how do we actually build those bridges? And I remember years ago I used to hitchhike, and that was always my thing
Mhm,
before I knew hitchhiking was dangerous.
mhm,
Was I want to leave each vehicle where people have thought about something different.
mm,
And, I want to make a connection. That was my only goal,
yeah.
and so that was kind of my own internal
Yeah.
game. And it was really beautiful because, over the years, you meet all sorts of
Yeah.
people. I
Yeah.
do have to share this one story. This one time I was hitchhiking and this man picked me up, this truck driver. I had no teeth. And he said, I don't want you to confuse my intelligence, my speech for my intelligence, because I left my teeth on a side table this morning. And so I don't have them. So I sound like this. And as it turned out, he told me he was, I don't forget which planet he was from, some alien.
Yeah.
And I'm like, why? And he's like, I'm checking things out on Earth. I'm like, I don't get why you're driving a truck. Like, don't you have a spaceship? And he goes, I wouldn't be incognito if I drove around a spaceship. I'm like, that's a very good point, you know, but it was so beautiful, right? To have, the place of connection, and I think it's a place of like, how do we, have a place of connection when there's so much stuff that we need, that needs to be dismantled.
Yeah.
Patience is one of them. you know Anger is important, but anger eats us,
Mhm,
right?
mhm,
And fierce love, and that accountability is like, what does that look like? And I don't mean it in a
yeah.
woo woo way. I mean real, because I see
Yeah.
people who are like love and light, and I'm just like, don't bypass the shit, because the
Yeah.
light and the dark exist.
Mm,
How do we actually make the changes? Like, what are you hoarding? I love that woman. uh there's a woman who came through on TV, I think Marie Kondo. I didn't watch it, but there was this wave of like, we need to get rid of and make everything minimal. And I watched
oh yeah.
people donate stuff, and I'm like, that's awesome, because there's just so much stuff,
Yeah.
and,
Yeah.
what is it that's gonna take for us to like, to make those shifts and get out of the us versus them
Yeah.
narrative,
Yeah.
you know because it is us and them, us versus them. It's us and them,
Mhm, mhm,
right? Even if we don't like them,
mm,
you know it's like, it's true, and I think, language is, I think that would be the piece, Vicky, that I see, is our language is so limiting
yeah.
and violent, right? And there's a really amazing poet named Joe Billows.
Mhm,
You
yeah.
can find them under Molly Billows on YouTube, and they have a couple of pieces that I'll never forget. One is on, I think it's on Stanley Park and the Lost Lagoon
Mm,
down there, and it's this beautiful story about, sort of colonization of a park,
yeah.
and it's brilliant. And then there is another one that they do, which is on myth and science, and
Mhm,
it is gorgeous of regards to how is it that we look at the world, and it's so myopic. Our
mm,
views, our ability actually to communicate is so limited, where there's other world views and ways of being,
yeah.
you know that aren't just some ideology. It's actually before it goes away, like I suggest that, since we're heading on this fast track into like, into Doomsville, that we actually start listening to, what is there around us, what other ways of being.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks for that. You know what? You kind of came full circle because you started by talking about being directed by wisdom.
Mm.
What would it be to be really directed by wisdom? Thanks so much for talking to me. I really appreciate this. I'm
Thank
just
you.
gonna have to think about it. I don't have any like, which is great. It's just this opener. So it's like this boom. I don't have any like, there's no sweet reflection kind of thing to stop this. There's this emergent something happening.
Right.
Really appreciate
Yeah.
that. And I appreciate all of our points of connection. I've also traveled a lot in this world and of an age that hitchhiking was just a couple of decades of my life, and just some of the best wisdom I've ever got has been on the road.
Right.
That life is a canoe trip shit that you and I share. And of course, then the points of difference, right? I think about that ideas about lateral liberation. I think about ideas of solidarity, about being points of connection, but not unity.
Yeah.
That the whole time we were hitchhiking, I was a white woman
Yeah.
and you were an Aboriginal woman, and that's very different, these, and yet there's still these points of different, there's points of connection and think
Right.
about that. Anyway, so I'm gonna think more
And
about
I think that's the piece, Vikki, is like, how are we connected,
yeah.
And I think that's really important. And again, when I say that, I also have like the flag for, and I'm not talking about you, but for people who are like, oh yes, and it's like, there's, and exactly what I'm talking about when I refer to people who are like, oh, well, we're connected. And it's like, yeah, we are connected, but actually, what are you doing to, lift the other person to, you
Yeah.
know, like example, fundraising. People don't want to give
Yeah.
unless they're going to get a, what do you call it? A tax
Tax
receipt.
receipt.
They don't really want to give. They just want to, and
Yeah.
all of that stuff, which is so confusing and sad, and just give because you can.
Fits right in with what you said though about the strawberries, and this idea about levels of giving, and it's like that's actually not giving. That's like just fitting into that charity versus that like idea of a justice model, like that lateral liberations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Sweet.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it's such a big one. I think about, and for people, and again, what's transformational? Music,
Hmm.
singing, dancing, all of the things that make us
All of
feel
those things
whole,
that
you
make
know,
culture.
and you said something that to me a long time ago, something about, when you were working with incarcerated people on death row, and or no, survivors of torture.
Survivor torture. Okay.
Yeah, and really just being able to like hold their stories, because like, what do you have as a white woman in North America? For me, it was like being in Haiti, and you know and in the Congo, and just unthinkable, tragedy, and really just holding the space for people to express themselves, and I see that in a society, like a man is that, I don't know if word manic society that we live in, where people need to express themselves, and I watch it when I step over the border. I'm just like, wow, Americans are really friendly people. They just like to talk and tell you
Yes.
things, and it's true. I go there and I'm just like, I just want to drink my coffee, and it's like
Yeah.
one person after the next is coming up and telling me the story, and I'm like, beautiful, okay, cool. Like,
Yeah.
how do we make space for that for each other?
Holding space. Yeah, I think about bearing witness, holding space, and I think the answer is connections, right? Like you're saying, everything is relational. For me, the problem is always disconnection. You can call it trauma, you can call it mental illness, call it whatever you want, but it's about disconnection. That's
Yeah,
always about abuses of power and oppression, and that the response is connection.
yeah,
But I'm really thinking about how ideas about lateral liberation might make more possibility for that. I'm just really,
right,
it's this a very beginning of
yeah,
thinking about those kind of ways. Yeah.
yeah. Thank you for having me, Vikki.
Thanks.
Awesome.
Always great to hear more from you.
Thank you.